The glove came off in one sharp pull, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing Wren Ashby had ever heard. She did not cry out. She had learned long ago not to cry out. 31 guests sat around the Earl of Dunmore's dining table that evening. She had counted them, the way she counted everything, the way her father the magistrate had taught her to count and measure and observe before she ever opened her mouth to speak. 31 guests, 14 candelabras, one very long table of polished mahogany that reflected the candlelight like a dark mirror along the walls. And now, because of what Lady Sylvia Dunmore had just done, 31 pairs of eyes were fixed on Wren's left hand. The burn scar ran from the base of her thumb to the inside of her wrist. Old and settled now, the skin pulled slightly, silvered at the edges. She had not looked at it herself in a very long time. She did not need to. She knew exactly what they were seeing. Lady Sylvia, the Earl's elder sister, 43 years old, and wearing the expression of a woman who had just won a game she'd been planning for weeks, sat back in her chair with the white glove dangling from her fingers like a trophy. "My apologies," she said, and her voice carried the particular smoothness of someone who was not sorry at all. "I thought it had slipped." Wren did not look at her. She looked at the candle directly across the table and kept her breathing even, in through the nose, out through the mouth, her father's voice in her head, steady and dry. "A courtroom is won by the person who stays calm the longest, Wren. Remember that." She had been remembering it for 6 weeks now, since the moment she'd arrived at Dunmore Hall as its new mistress. Since the moment Lady Sylvia had made clear, in a dozen small ways before this very large one, that she considered Wren Ashby, daughter of a country magistrate, granddaughter of a schoolteacher, owner of no title and no fortune, to be a temporary inconvenience in a house that rightfully belonged to her influence. At the far end of the table, the Earl of Dunmore had gone very still. Cormac Dunmore was not a man who moved quickly. He was the sort of man who considered things, who stood at windows for long minutes, who chose his words the way other men chose racehorses, with patience and an eye for what would last. In the 6 weeks since their wedding, Wren had learned to read him the way she read weather. The slight tension around his jaw meant he was thinking. The stillness in his hands meant he had already decided something. His hands were very still now, but before he could speak, Lady Sylvia pressed on, because women like Sylvia Dunmore understood instinctively that momentum was everything, that once you had the room's attention, you had to drive the nail before the hammer cooled. "We were all wondering," Sylvia said pleasantly, turning to address the table rather than Wren directly, as though Wren were a piece of furniture under discussion. "You've worn gloves to every dinner since your arrival, my dear, even in summer, even indoors." She paused. "People do talk, you know. People talk about a great many things," Wren said. Her own voice surprised her. It was calm, steady. She set her bare left hand flat on the tablecloth and did not flinch. 31 guests looked at the scar. There was a terrible quiet moment, the kind that stretches like taffy, thin and sweet and about to snap. And then something shifted in the room. She could feel it before she could name it. The woman seated 2 places to her left, a baroness whose name Wren had already memorized along with the names of all 31's guests, let out a breath that was almost a sound of recognition. The young lord across from her looked down at his plate. An older gentleman near the centre of the table pressed his lips together and said nothing which was its own kind of statement. They were not what Sylvia had wanted. Sylvia had wanted gasps, whispers, the delicious cruelty of shared amusement. She had wanted Wren to be exposed as something lesser, something shameful, someone who had crept into this house with hidden damage that made her unworthy of the seat she now occupied. What she had gotten instead was a table full of people looking at a young woman's scarred hand and thinking, privately and all at once, about how a scar like that is made. "It was a fire," Wren said. Her voice was still even. "When I was 9 years old, my father's study caught. I went in after his papers because he was away at court and I knew what those papers were." She looked up then, not at Sylvia, but at the room in general, the way her father had taught her to address a jury. They were witness testimonies for a trial. The man accused had very powerful friends, and someone had decided the case should not proceed. She paused. "The papers were saved. The case proceeded. My father won." She looked at her hand. "I have been rather proud of this scar ever since." The room was absolutely silent, And then the Baroness of Hartwell said, quietly and without any visible drama, "Good girl." That was the beginning, or rather, that was the middle, the moment Wren had been building toward for 6 weeks without knowing exactly how it would arrive. The beginning was somewhere else entirely. The beginning was a letter, and a proposition, and a grey Tuesday morning, in the parlour of a house that smelled of ink and paper, and the particular mustiness of a library that hadn't been dusted in a year. Wren had been 23 when her father died. He had left her the house, the library, and a modest annuity that would keep her fed and clothed if she was careful. He had also left her quite by accident a reputation. She had spent 4 years assisting him, not as a secretary, exactly. Not as a clerk, but as something in between. She had a mind for detail and a memory that worked like a filing cabinet. She could read a legal document once and reproduce its essential points from memory 3 weeks later. She could spot the inconsistency in a witness account the way other people spotted a wrong note in a piece of music. The letter arrived 8 months after her father's death. It was from the Earl of Dunmore's solicitor, and it was very formal, and it took 3 careful readings before Wren understood what it was actually offering. The Earl's first wife had died 2 years prior. There were no children. The Earl needed an heir, and he needed, the solicitor's careful language made plain, a wife who was capable of running a complex household without assistance, who was intelligent enough to be trusted with matters that most wives were not consulted about, and who had no interest in the social manoeuvring that had made his first marriage. The letter did not say this directly, but it was written in the shape of every sentence, quietly miserable. Someone had recommended her. She never found out who. She had written back asking for a meeting, not with the solicitor, with the Earl himself. He had agreed, which was the first thing about him that surprised her. He was taller than she'd expected and quieter than the portraits she'd seen of his family suggested. He had dark eyes that stayed on her face throughout their conversation without restlessness, which most men's did not when speaking to women they considered beneath them socially. He had asked her within the first 10 minutes what she thought of the current state of land reform in the northern counties. She had told him. At length. He had listened. He had asked 2 follow-up questions that demonstrated he had actually processed what she said rather than simply waiting for her to finish. By the end of an hour, they had reached something that was not precisely an agreement, but was the shape of one. He wanted a practical wife. She needed a secure position. They were both, in their different ways, tired of pretending to be something they were not. She had asked him, before she left, one direct question. "Your sister lives at Dunmore Hall." "She does," he said. "She won't approve of me." "No," he said. "She won't." Wren had considered this. "Will that be a problem?" Cormac Dunmore had looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't been able to read then, and could only understand later as something close to relief. "Not," he said, "for me." She had said yes. She had packed 2 trunks and a crate of her father's books, and married him on a Wednesday morning in early May, with no guests and no flowers, and a wedding breakfast of very good coffee and slightly burned toast that his cook had apologized for twice. She had thought, in her careful, methodical way, that she was prepared for what came next. She had underestimated Lady Sylvia Dunmore. Sylvia had been mistress of Dunmore Hall in everything but title for 11 years. She had managed the household accounts after her brother's first wife. The fragile and docile Lavinia had found them overwhelming. She had organised the social calendar, curated the guest lists, decided which tenants' requests reached Cormac's desk, and which were quietly filed away. She was 5 years older than her brother, and she had never married, and she had built, within the walls of Dunmore Hall, an authority so total that it had become invisible to everyone inside it. She had not expected Cormac to remarry, or rather, she had not expected it to matter. His first marriage had been carefully managed. Lavinia had been sweet and pliable, and utterly dependent on Sylvia's guidance in all things. She had made a comfortable ally, grateful, compliant, and too nervous of social error to ever question the quiet architecture of power that Sylvia maintained. Cormac had been fond of his first wife in the way one is fond of a well-trained dog, gently, distantly, with a kind of affection that never inconvenienced anyone. This was different. Sylvia had known it the moment Wren arrived. Not the moment she stepped out of the carriage. Wren was not impressive to look at, exactly, though she was handsome enough in a spare, serious way that made Sylvia think of a hunting knife. Nothing decorative about it, but quite obviously made for a purpose. She had known it the moment she offered to show Wren the household accounts, and Wren had sat down, opened the first ledger, and within 4 minutes located a discrepancy in the quarterly grain purchases that Sylvia had been quietly managing to her own advantage for 3 years. Wren had not said anything. She had simply set a small mark in pencil beside the entry and turned the page, but Sylvia had seen her eyes. From that moment it was war. It was conducted, as such wars always are in houses like Dunmore Hall, at a level of extraordinary surface civility. Sylvia rearranged the placement of Wren's personal correspondence without acknowledgement. Wren began having her letters delivered directly to the study. Sylvia scheduled social calls during the hours Wren had reserved for reviewing the estate management files. Wren reviewed them at midnight instead, which Cormac discovered when he came looking for her at 12:30, and found her at the desk with a lamp and a pot of cold tea, making notes in her small, precise handwriting with the focused contentment of a woman engaged in something she found genuinely interesting. He had asked if she needed anything. She had said better tea would be welcome. He had gone to the kitchen himself and come back with it, and they had sat in companionable silence for an hour while she worked and he read, and something between them had begun very quietly to shift. Sylvia did not miss it. She noticed everything. The dinner party was her final stratagem. 31 guests, most of whom she had cultivated for decades. A table where she controlled the placement, the conversation, the atmosphere. A new wife who had, in 6 weeks, committed no visible social error and provided Sylvia with no legitimate opening. And then she had noticed the gloves. Wren wore them every evening without fail. White gloves, always, to every dinner, to every drawing-room gathering, every time she presided over the table as the Countess of Dunmore. In summer, in warmth, never without them. Something to hide, Sylvia had thought. Something useful. She had planned the moment carefully. The gentle jostle. She was seated 2 places to Wren's right, close enough. During the second course, when the serving staff were occupied, and the conversation was loud enough that a small physical accident would read as innocence. The pull was easy. The glove came free in her hand before Wren had a chance to react. And then the silence, and then the scar, and then the story of a 9-year-old girl running into a burning room after evidence that would convict a corrupt man, because her father needed those papers, and she was the only one there. Sylvia looked at the table. She looked at the Baroness, who had said good girl with the casual certainty of a woman awarding a point. She looked at the guests she had known for 20 years and saw on their faces an expression she had never directed at herself. She looked at her brother. Cormac was looking at his wife. The rest of the evening passed in the way such evenings do, when something enormous has been contained inside the shell of ordinary social form. Dinner concluded. The party retired to the drawing-room. Wren spoke easily with 3 different guests, and managed the room with a grace so unobtrusive that it looked like nothing at all, which was, Sylvia recognised with a cold and sinking clarity, the hardest possible thing to do. When the last carriage had rolled down the drive, and the house had settled into the specific quiet of late night, Wren went to the library. She did not know that Cormac followed her. She heard the door and looked up, and he was standing in the frame the way he stood at windows, entirely still, reading something she couldn't name. "You planned that," he said, not accusingly. More the way one states a fact one finds interesting. "I planned for the possibility of it," she said. "Your sister has been looking for something for 6 weeks. I knew she'd found the gloves." She set her book down. "I decided I would rather choose how that conversation went than let her choose for me." He was quiet for a moment. "The story, about the fire, and the papers, is true," she said. "Every word." "I know," he said. "I know whose daughter you are. I've read about that trial." He came further into the room, which was unusual. He generally kept a careful distance that she had until recently taken for indifference. "I should have asked you about it before now." "You could ask me now," she said. So he did. They talked until the fire burned down and the lamp needed refilling. She told him about her father's cases, the ones that had mattered, the ones that had cost him. She told him about the year after he died, the specific loneliness of a house full of books and no one to argue with. He told her, carefully, slowly, in the way he did everything, about Lavinia, and how gentle she had been, and how he had understood too late that gentleness and happiness are not the same thing. He told her about Sylvia, and what he had allowed to happen inside his own house, and how the word for it, if he was honest, was abdication. "She'll have to go," Wren said. "Yes," he said, "not because of the glove." She met his eyes. "Because of the ledgers. What she's been doing with the grain accounts." "I know about the grain accounts," he said quietly. "You marked them in pencil." "I did." "You didn't say anything to me." "I was waiting," she said, "to see what kind of man you are." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, somewhere in the park, an owl called once and then went silent. "And what did you decide?" he said. She considered the question with the same seriousness she gave to everything. Legal documents, household accounts, men standing in lamplit libraries at 2 a.m. asking her to judge them. "I decided," she said, "that you knew and were ashamed, which is more useful than not knowing, and considerably more useful than knowing and not caring." He was quiet. Then, "That is possibly the most precise compliment I have ever received." "I'm not known for flattery," she said. "No," he said, and something in his voice had shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the way that a door shifts when the lock finally turns. The thing was the same, but it would never quite close the same way again. "You're not." Lady Sylvia Dunmore left Dunmore Hall on a Wednesday in September, 14 days after the dinner party. The departure was handled with full courtesy. The carriage, the arrangement of a comfortable house in Bath that Cormac had owned for years and never used. A settlement generous enough that no one could characterize it as anything but brotherly consideration. Sylvia had not argued. This was the thing that stayed with Wren afterward, the detail that seemed important. She had not argued. She had packed her rooms with the methodical efficiency of someone who had always known, underneath everything, that the ground she stood on was not truly hers. On the morning she left, she passed Wren in the entrance hall. Wren had not moved aside and had not advanced. She had simply stood at the foot of the stairs, wearing no gloves at all, her left hand visible and unhidden in the morning light. Sylvia looked at the scar. Then she looked at Wren's face. She said nothing. She walked through the door and did not look back. The house was different after that, not transformed, not in the sudden dramatic way of novels, where every room is brighter and the garden blooms on command. It was quieter, mostly, a different quality of quiet, the kind that comes when something held tense finally releases. Wren spent her mornings on the estate business, which was considerable, and had been badly managed in certain areas beyond the grain accounts. She began working with the head steward, a careful man named Howell, who had been waiting for years for someone to actually listen to him, and between them they identified 6 separate areas of improvement in the first month alone. She wrote her recommendations in detailed memoranda and left them on Cormac's desk, and he read them, annotated them, and came to discuss them with her at dinner in a way that made dinner feel, for the first time in either of their lives, like something to look forward to. She was not soft exactly, neither was he, but there was a texture to their evenings now that had not been there before. A kind of ease that was different from comfort, more active than rest, the particular pleasure of 2 people who had each spent years in the company of minds, less interesting than their own. One evening in November, 5 months after the wedding, he reached across the dinner table and took her bare left hand in his. Not dramatically, the way one picks up something that belongs to oneself. Naturally, without announcement. She looked at their hands. "The case your father won," he said. "The man who had the powerful friends. Yes, what happened to him?" "He was transported," she said. 14 years. He died on the ship." Cormac was quiet for a moment, his thumb resting on the scar. "And the friends. Lost 2 of them at the next election," she said. "My father testified before a committee. He was rather good at committees. You must miss him," he said. She looked at their hands again. His were large and careful, the hands of a man who had been taught to manage things and had only recently begun to understand that managing is not the same as loving. "I do," she said, "but I think he would have liked this." "A practical marriage of convenience?" Cormac said, and there was something in his voice, very dry, very quiet. That was almost a smile. He would not have called it that by November, she said. She felt his hand tighten slightly around hers. Just slightly. The way a man might grip something he is deciding, quietly, that he would prefer not to let go of. Outside, the first real cold of winter had settled over the park. The fire in the dining room had burned down to a deep red glow. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 9, and then the house was quiet again. That different quiet, the one that felt like breathing, like something that had learned, finally, to rest. Wren did not move her hand. She thought about a 9-year-old girl running into a burning room because the evidence mattered and someone had to save it. She thought about all the years she had worn the scar-covered, not from shame. She had meant every word she said at that table, but from the exhausting practical necessity of not giving people something to focus on instead of her mind. She thought about the moment the glove came off, and 31 people saw what she'd been hiding, and how it had not been, in the end, anything like the disaster Sylvia had intended. The best evidence, her father used to say, is the kind that speaks for itself. She supposed he had been right about that, too.